All right, guys, so this is the Unit 4B review sheet. Again, similar to the previous unit, we have to break these down into 5-minute videos, so there's going to be a couple of them. So starting with question number 1, identify the problems caused by industrialization that the progressives sought to reform. There were several problems they wanted to address. Some of those included really poor housing conditions, especially in cities where there were tenements, poor sanitation and disease that spread in cities, political corruption, again, centered on big cities, unsafe food and drugs, many abuses by the railroads that negatively affected farmers, and finally, the lack of women's rights, specifically the lack of women's suffrage or the right to vote. Number 2, what class of people led most of these progressive reforms during this time period? It was mostly the middle class, especially upper middle class women. And why were they able to do this? Basically, they had the time and they were educated, so they took on a lot of these reform efforts. Number 3, what was a muckraker? A muckraker was a writer or a journalist or a photographer who sought to expose some of these problems caused by industrialization. The muckrakers themselves couldn't solve the problems, but they exposed them with the help the government or the hope the government would step in to try to address some of them. So some of these muckrakers that we learned about were Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which was about the meat industry, and the publication of The Jungle led the government to pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Jacob Riis was a photographer who published a book of photographs called How the Other Half Lives. The publication of this book led to there to be housing reform, including the destruction of some of the worst tenements, the building of indoor plumbing, the inclusion of playgrounds around some of these tenements in the cities. And finally, Ida Tarbell wrote a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company, where she exposed some of the abuses and some of the monopolistic practices of that company. And that eventually led to the Standard Oil Trust being broken up by the government. Number 4, some other progressive reformers that weren't muckrakers were Jane Addams. She led the Settlement House movement to help immigrants assimilate into American society. Margaret Sanger was a reformer who helped increase access to birth control. And finally, John Muir was someone who pushed for more environmental preservation and protection. Number 5, what was the Meat Inspection Act? The Meat Inspection Act, as the name implies, was a law that required the federal government to inspect meat processing facilities to make sure they were clean and to ensure sanitation in those facilities. Number 6, the Pure Food and Drug Act. This required accurate labeling of food and drugs, and it required the labels on drugs to actually be true in terms of saying what the drug could do and what kind of diseases it might cure. Number 7, explain how each of these expanded democracy during the progressive era. So the secret ballot basically prevents voter intimidation because other people wouldn't know who you voted for. The recall was a law that allowed voters to actually vote someone out of office before their term was up. The referendum allowed voters and not legislators to actually decide to pass laws or not. And finally, the 17th Amendment provided for the direct election of federal senators by the people instead of having them appointed by state legislatures. The common theme here, guys, for all of these is that they gave more political power to citizens, more political power to the people. Number 8, what is patronage? Kind of similar to the spoil system we talked about under Andrew Jackson. The idea behind patronage is that you give government jobs to your friends and political supporters. The Pendleton Act, or the Civil Service Act, helped reduce this practice because this required civil servants or government workers to take a test so that only qualified people got these government jobs. Number 9, describe some of the tactics used by women in the suffrage movement. Some of their tactics to push for the right to vote included having parades, lobbying Congress, having picket lines set up in front of the White House, and once they got arrested, going on hunger strikes while they were in jail. Number 10, how did World War I affect the suffrage movement? So women basically referred to their contribution to the war effort as evidence as to why they should be allowed to have that right to vote. And also because World War I was fought to expand democracy, and women pointed out the contradiction of fighting to expand democracy in the rest of the world, why they couldn't have the right to vote at home. All right, that ends video number 1.